I started my hike early in the morning, before the sun was fully up. The air was cool and still, the kind of air that feels fresh in your lungs but also carries a sharp chill. My backpack felt heavy on my shoulders as I adjusted the straps and set off along the narrow dirt trail. The forest around me was quiet except for the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of a bird somewhere high above. I had chosen this route because it was known to be challenging, with steep climbs, loose rock, and a long stretch that followed a ridge line. The trail was not popular, and that was exactly what I wanted. I had been looking for solitude, a chance to push myself and to feel what it was like to be truly on my own in the wild. I had done many hikes before, but something about this one felt different from the start. The first section of the trail climbed gradually through thick forest. The trees were tall and crowded close together, their branches forming a roof that kept most of the light out. The ground was damp, and patches of fog lingered in the low areas. I could smell the strong scent of wet earth and pine needles. My breathing was steady at first, but I could already feel the weight of the climb in my legs. As I pushed deeper, the forest grew quieter. The birds stopped calling, and even the wind seemed to settle. I kept moving, step by step, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. I focused on the rhythm of my movements, trying not to think about how far I still had to go. My goal was to reach the ridge before midday. I had studied the map carefully, and I knew that once I reached the ridge, I would have several miles of exposed trail to follow before the descent. After a while, the ground grew steeper and rockier. The trees began to thin, and the fog cleared as I climbed higher. The sun had risen by then, casting light across the slopes, but most of the trail ahead was still in shadow. I felt sweat on my back, soaking into my shirt beneath the straps of my pack. My breathing grew heavier, and I paused a few times to rest, leaning against boulders and sipping water. When I finally broke out of the tree line, I stopped to catch my breath. The view was wide and open, with layers of hills stretching out into the distance. The ridge I was aiming for rose ahead of me, narrow and sharp, with steep drops on either side. It looked both beautiful and intimidating. I could see the trail cutting across it, a thin line that seemed to cling to the rock. I pressed on, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. The wind picked up as I climbed, whistling through cracks in the rock and tugging at my clothes. The trail was rough here, with loose gravel that shifted under my boots. Every step had to be deliberate. I moved carefully, planting my poles, testing the ground before putting my weight down. A slip here could send me tumbling down the slope, and there would be little chance of stopping. The ridge was everything I had imagined and more. On one side, the land dropped away sharply into a valley full of trees. On the other, it fell even steeper, a sheer rock face that seemed to plunge forever. The trail along the top was barely wide enough for one person. My heart pounded as I stepped onto it, my eyes fixed on the path in front of me. I tried not to look down, but it was impossible not to notice the emptiness on either side. The wind was stronger now, gusting suddenly and making me sway. I kept my body low, leaning slightly into the slope. My palms were sweaty inside my gloves, and I gripped my poles tightly. Every step felt like a test. My legs shook with the effort of staying steady. I told myself to focus, to move slowly, to stay calm. Halfway across the ridge, I felt a shift beneath my foot. A piece of rock slid away, clattering down the slope. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment, I thought I was going to fall. My other foot held, and I pressed myself against the slope, breathing hard. I waited until my legs stopped trembling before I forced myself to keep going. The ridge seemed endless. Time stretched out, each minute feeling longer than the last. My pack pulled at my shoulders, making me feel off balance. My throat was dry, but I didn't dare stop to drink. I just kept moving, step after careful step, until finally the trail began to widen. When I reached a small flat area, I dropped my pack and sat down, shaking with relief. From where I sat, I could see the trail continuing along the ridge, winding upward toward a rocky peak. Beyond that, the land stretched far into the horizon, endless ridges and valleys fading into the haze. It should have been beautiful, but all I could feel was the weight of where I was and how dangerous it had been to get there. I ate a quick snack, my hands still trembling. I knew I couldn't stay long. The weather was changing. Clouds were moving in from the west, dark and heavy. The wind carried a chill now, sharper than before. I packed up quickly and kept moving. The next stretch of trail was even narrower, the kind of path where one wrong step meant there would be nothing to catch you. I felt my nerves fray with each gust of wind. My breathing was fast, shallow, and I could hear the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. At one point, the trail crossed a section of broken rock where the ridge had crumbled. The only way forward was to scramble across, hands and feet pressed against the stone. The drop below yawned open, dizzying in its depth. My pack shifted as I moved, throwing off my balance. I pressed myself close to the rock, inching forward. My muscles burned with the effort. By the time I pulled myself back onto the trail, my arms and legs were shaking uncontrollably. I sat down again, gripping the ground beneath me. I couldn't believe how exposed I was. There was no one else on the trail, no one for miles. If anything happened to me here, no one would know. The thought chilled me more than the wind. I forced myself to stand and kept going. The ridge rose toward the peak, and I climbed steadily, my body aching with exhaustion. My water was running low, and I had to ration it carefully. The sky grew darker as the clouds thickened, and I knew a storm was coming. When the first drops of rain fell, I was still on the ridge. The rocks grew slick almost immediately, and the wind doubled in strength. I crouched low, moving as carefully as I could, my heart hammering with fear. The rain turned into a steady downpour, soaking me to the skin, blurring my vision. The trail beneath me became slippery, and I slid more than once, catching myself just in time. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the deep rumble of thunder. The sound echoed across the ridge, rolling through the valleys below. My stomach twisted with dread. Being on an exposed ridge during a storm was the last place I wanted to be, but there was no shelter, nowhere to go but forward. I pushed on, every step a fight against the wind and rain. My clothes clung to me, heavy with water. My boots squelched with each step. My fingers were numb, and my body shivered with cold. The storm raged around me, and I felt small and helpless, clinging to the thin strip of ground between two deadly drops. When I finally reached the far end of the ridge, I almost collapsed with relief. The trail began to descend into the trees again, offering some shelter. I stumbled down, branches whipping against my wet clothes, mud sucking at my boots. The storm still roared above, but the trees broke some of the wind and rain. I kept moving until I found a small flat spot among the trees. I dropped my pack, too tired to go any farther. I set up my tarp as best I could in the pouring rain, fumbling with cold hands. It wasn't perfect, but it gave me some cover. I sat beneath it, soaked and shaking, forcing down a few bites of food. The storm went on for hours. I sat there, listening to the rain pound on the tarp, the thunder rolling, the wind tearing through the trees. I felt trapped, like the forest was pressing in around me. My thoughts grew dark. I wondered if I had made a mistake coming out here alone. I wondered if anyone would even know where to look for me if something happened. By the time the storm finally passed, it was night. The forest was pitch black, the air damp and heavy. I lay in my sleeping bag, every muscle sore, my nerves frayed. Couldn't sleep. Every sound made me tense. The crack of a branch, the rush of water, the distant rumble of thunder still echoing. When dawn finally came, I packed up quickly. I wanted nothing more than to get off the mountain. The trail down was steep and muddy, every step a struggle to stay upright. My body ached, my mind was tired, but I kept moving. Took me hours, slipping and stumbling, but eventually the trees began to thin. The ground leveled out, the trail widened, and then, at last, I saw the small parking area where my car waited. When I reached it, I dropped my pack onto the ground and sat heavily on the bumper, my whole body trembling with exhaustion. I looked back at the ridge, still hidden in clouds, and I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that I had made it out, dread at how close I had come to losing control out there. I realized then how dangerous it had been, how foolish it was to take that trail. I decided to take a long hike one summer weekend, choosing a trail I had never been on before. It was called Ridge Trail, tucked away in a forested area that stretched for miles. I wanted something challenging but not impossible, something that would keep me out most of the day and give me a sense of being far from everything. I had been hiking for years, so I thought I was ready for it. I packed my backpack carefully with water bottles, a small first aid kit, trail mix, a headlamp, and a thin emergency blanket in case I ended up staying longer than planned. I left my phone in airplane mode to save battery, only using it for the GPS map when I needed to check my position. The trail started out simple, wide, and clear. The dirt was dry under my boots, and the air was heavy with the smell of pine. The sun filtered down through the tall trees, cutting the ground into shifting patches of light and shade. I liked that feeling, the way the forest seemed to breathe around me. I walked at a steady pace, trying to keep my breathing even. The sound of my boots crunching gravel and sticks was the only noise for the first hour. As the morning passed, the trail grew narrower and rougher. Roots pushed up through the dirt like twisted ropes, and some sections of the path looked like they hadn't been maintained in years. I had to step carefully, lifting my feet higher than usual so I wouldn't trip. On one steep section, loose rocks rolled under my boots, and I had to grab a tree trunk to steady myself. It was harder than I thought it would be, but it was the kind of challenge I liked. By late morning, the trail began climbing in earnest. My thighs started to burn, sweat dripped down my back, and every time I thought I was near the top, another ridge appeared above me. The air grew cooler as I gained elevation, and the trees thinned out, letting me see further in the distance. Jagged cliffs cut across the horizon, and the forest stretched below like a dark green sea. The view made the effort feel worth it. I stopped on a flat rock to eat some trail mix and sip water. My heartbeat slowed, and I took a long look around. The silence was heavy, almost pressing. No distant voices, no car sounds, not even a plane in the sky. Only the faint whistle of wind and the occasional snap of a branch far away. I realized how alone I really was. When I continued, I noticed the trail markers were less frequent. I followed faint signs carved into tree bark, a few painted arrows that looked faded. My GPS app still showed me on track, but I had to glance at it more often. The trail bent sharply and dipped into a shadowed ravine where the air felt colder. The slope down was steep, with damp leaves making it slippery. I moved slowly, digging my heels in. At the bottom, a stream cut across the path, its water dark and fast. I used a fallen log to cross, balancing carefully. On the far side, the trail was less clear. It wound upward again, but the ground was muddied, and I noticed tracks pressed into it. At first, I thought they were deer or elk, but then I saw boot prints, large and heavy, going in the same direction I was. They looked fresh. I hadn't seen anyone all day, so it made me pause. The idea of someone else being out there comforted me a little, but it also unsettled me. Whoever it was had gone this way not long ago. I pushed on. The climb grew sharper, forcing me to lean forward and use my hands to pull myself up over rocks. Loose dirt crumbled under my grip, and I had to be careful not to slip. My breathing grew ragged. Sweat stung my eyes, and I felt a dull ache spreading in my lower back. At last, the ridge opened into a high clearing. The view stretched wide, mountains stacked in the distance, blue and hazy. The forest below looked endless. I could see no roads, no towns, no rooftops, nothing man-made. Just wilderness. The air felt thinner up there, cleaner too, but the emptiness pressed down on me. It was beautiful, but it also made me feel small. I sat on a boulder to rest and drink more water. My hands shook slightly as I unscrewed the cap. The quiet was broken only by my own breath and the faint rustle of wind. I thought about how far I had come. My legs felt heavy, but I knew I had to turn back soon if I wanted to return before dark. That was when I saw movement near the tree line below the ridge. A figure, distant, barely visible through the trees. It looked like a person walking slowly, but the angle made it hard to tell. They were far below me, moving in the same direction the trail would lead on the way back. At first, I thought it was the hiker whose prints I'd seen earlier, but something about the way they moved didn't look right. They didn't walk with the steady rhythm of a normal hiker. It was slower, almost dragging. I watched until the trees blocked my view, and I felt an uneasy knot form in my stomach. I decided not to stay on the ridge much longer. The sun had begun its slow dip, and the shadows grew longer across the rocks. I tightened my backpack straps and started down. The descent was harder than I expected. My knees jolted with every step, and the loose dirt made me slip more than once. I leaned heavily on my trekking pole, planting it firmly each time. The forest swallowed me quickly, cutting off the sky. Halfway down, I spotted the prints again. They led in the same direction, pressed deep into the mud. But now I noticed something else. Some of the prints looked unsteady, angled strangely, as if the person had been limping. I crouched down to look closer. The edges of the prints were sharp, fresh. Whoever it was had passed by recently. The air grew heavy as I moved forward. Every sound seemed louder, the crunch of my boots, the snap of a twig. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the trail was empty, stretching back into shadows. I told myself to stay calm, to focus on the path. I crossed the stream again, balancing carefully on the log, but as I stepped off, I thought I heard something. A faint splash, like something else had moved through the water. I froze, holding my breath. The forest was silent again. I forced myself to keep walking. The ravine climb drained me. My thighs burned, and sweat soaked through my shirt even though the air was cooler now. By the time I reached the top, the light had changed, dimmer, tinted orange. I realized I had less time than I thought. I picked up my pace, but the trail seemed longer on the way back. The trees looked unfamiliar, though I knew I was following the markers. My chest felt tight, not just from exertion but from unease. I thought about that figure again, the dragging way they had moved. At one point, I rounded a bend and saw the prints again. This time, they overlapped mine from earlier. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was had doubled back, walking the same trail behind me. My skin prickled. I tightened my grip on the trekking pole, using it more like a weapon than a support. The light drained faster than I wanted. The forest grew darker, colors fading into gray. I put on my headlamp, its beam cutting a narrow path through the trees. The shadows beyond it looked thicker. Every step felt louder now, as if the night was listening. I kept walking, steady but fast, scanning the trail constantly. My water was almost gone, and my legs ached with every movement. I wanted nothing more than to reach the parking lot, to see my car, to feel that relief of safety. But the prints haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about how fresh they looked, how close they seemed. Several times I thought I heard faint steps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing but empty trail. The trees creaked, branches shifted, and my imagination filled in the rest. At last, I reached the wider section of trail near the start. My legs nearly gave out from the relief of seeing it. The dirt was packed, familiar. I hurried down it, my headlamp bouncing light across the path. The forest was black now, the air cold against my sweat-soaked skin. When the parking lot came into view, I felt my chest loosen. My car sat alone under the weak glow of a street lamp. But as I drew closer, I noticed something that froze me in place. Muddy footprints smeared across the pavement, circling near my car. They were the same prints I had followed on the trail. Large, heavy, uneven. I stood there, heart hammering. The night was silent, too silent. I forced myself forward, fumbling with my keys. I yanked the door open, threw my backpack inside, and locked the doors as fast as I could. My hands shook as I started the engine. The headlights swept across the lot, illuminating the edge of the trees. For just a second, I thought I saw movement there, a shadow slipping back into the forest. I didn't wait to look closer. I slammed the car into gear and drove off, gravel crunching under the tires. The whole drive back, I couldn't stop looking in the mirrors. My throat was dry, and my hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles hurt. By the time I reached the highway, I finally let out the breath I had been holding. I never found out who left those prints or why they had circled my car. Maybe it was another hiker, maybe not. All I know is that I was never as glad to see the lights of town. I had always thought of myself as careful when it came to hiking. I was not the kind of person who rushed into things without preparation. I usually checked maps, packed more water than I thought I needed, carried food, a flashlight, and basic first aid. I even had a habit of telling someone where I would be going, just in case something happened. But on this trip, I made one mistake. It wasn't a huge one at first, but out there in the woods, a small mistake grows into something big. The hike was supposed to be simple. It was a loop trail in a national forest that people often described as easy but beautiful, with creeks, ridges, and open clearings. I planned to start early, walk the loop, take some pictures, eat lunch by the stream, and get back to my car before dark. The whole thing was about 11 miles. I had done longer hikes before, so I didn't think much of it. The morning was cool when I parked my car. I checked my backpack again before locking the doors. Water bottles, jerky, protein bars, flashlight, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, lighter, whistle, knife. I had it all. I set off with the trail map folded in my jacket pocket. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well-marked, wide, and soft under my boots. The trees were tall pines mixed with oaks, their branches swaying with the light wind. Birds called out, and I could hear the steady rush of a creek nearby. I felt good, relaxed, even though the forest had that heavy quiet that sometimes feels too deep. It didn't bother me at that point. By the time I reached mile 4, the trail narrowed. Roots stuck up, rocks jutted from the dirt, and I had to watch each step. The map showed a small fork ahead that curved down toward a stream before circling back to the main trail. I figured I would take that detour. I wanted to refill one of my bottles from the stream with my filter, and the sound of moving water always made a perfect place to rest. When I reached the fork, the signpost was leaning and the paint on it was almost faded. One arrow pointed left, one right, but the letters were worn. I thought I could still make them out. I took the right path, sure it was the stream trail. The ground sloped down steeply, and the trees grew denser. The air turned cooler, damp with the smell of wet soil. After about half a mile, I realized something felt off. The trail was less clear, like fewer people used it. Brush scraped at my legs, and branches hung low across the path. I pushed on anyway. I didn't think I had gone wrong. I kept expecting the sound of water, but I couldn't hear any. The silence pressed in heavier now, like the forest had swallowed all noise. I stopped, looked around, and tried to listen. Nothing. No birds, no breeze, not even the faint rush of a stream. I checked my map. The problem was, the map was small and didn't show every minor side trail. I convinced myself this was still right. It had to lead somewhere. I walked another 15 minutes. The slope grew steeper. The dirt crumbled under my boots, sending small stones rolling ahead of me. I kept my balance with the help of tree trunks, but soon I was half sliding instead of walking. I thought about turning back, but looking up the hill I had just come down made my stomach sink. It would be hard to climb back. I told myself the trail must meet the stream at the bottom, so I kept going. Finally, I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable, running water. Relief washed over me. I moved faster, ignoring how narrow the path had become. Soon the trees opened into a ravine. At the bottom, a stream cut through the rocks, clear and fast. I dropped my pack, knelt, and let the cool water wash over my hands. I filled my bottle with the filter and drank. For a moment, everything felt fine again. But then I looked around. The trail behind me had almost disappeared into brush. I turned to look for where it might continue, but all I saw were steep walls of the ravine on either side. No clear path led out. My relief started to fade. I tried climbing up one side. The dirt was loose and my boots slid back with each step. I grabbed roots, but they tore out in my hands. After 10 minutes of struggling, I stood at the bottom again, breathing hard, sweat dripping into my eyes. The water sound that had been comforting now felt like it was mocking me. I checked my phone. One bar flickered, then vanished. No signal. I checked the time. It was already past noon. I decided to follow the stream. Streams almost always lead to bigger creeks, sometimes to roads or at least areas where people might go. I packed my things and started walking along the edge, stepping on wet stones, ducking under branches. The further I went, the rougher it became. The banks grew steeper with boulders wedged into them. I had to climb over slick rocks, my boots slipping, my hands scraping on sharp edges. At one point, I slipped completely, falling into the shallow water. My knee banged hard against a rock. Pain shot up my leg. I sat in the cold stream for a minute, gritting my teeth, trying to breathe through it. When I pulled my leg out, the skin was torn open, blood running down. Not deep enough for stitches, but bad enough to sting with every step after that. I wrapped it with gauze from my kit, tied it tight, and kept moving. Each step hurt, but I couldn't stop. The sun moved lower, shadows stretching across the ravine. Hours passed. I lost track of distance. The stream twisted and turned endlessly, cutting deeper into the ground. The walls rose higher until I felt trapped in a canyon. The silence was broken only by the water and the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. Every sound made me flinch. A snapping branch somewhere above me, a splash downstream. My mind jumped to thoughts of animals. Bears, cougars. I carried a knife, but I knew it would do little if something decided to stalk me. At one bend, I froze. Prints in the mud. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. Human feet, wide and long, pressed deep into the wet ground. They led from the bank into the trees, then vanished. My stomach tightened. Who walked barefoot out here? Why? I stared at them for a long time before moving on, forcing myself not to think about it. The light dimmed until I had to use my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, catching the reflection of wet rocks and the shine of eyes now and then. Deer, probably, but each pair froze me in place until they darted away. I finally found a flat patch above the bank and decided to stop for the night. My knee throbbed. I ate a protein bar, drank water, and lit a small fire with dry sticks. The flames gave me comfort, but the dark pressed heavy around me. I barely slept. Every crack of wood or rustle of leaves snapped my eyes open. Morning came slow, gray and damp. I packed up and pushed on, limping worse than before. My bandage was soaked with blood. I changed it with the last of my gauze. I had food for maybe one more day. By midday, the ravine opened slightly, but instead of a way out, I found a fallen tree blocking the stream. Its trunk was massive, covered in moss. I tried to climb over, but slipped on the slick bark and fell hard, smashing my shoulder. Pain spread across my chest. I lay there for a while, staring up at the canopy, wondering how I had gotten into this mess from one wrong turn. When I forced myself up, I noticed something. A faded piece of fabric caught on the tree. Torn, dirty, like it had been there for years. It looked like part of a shirt. Nearby, half buried in the mud, was a rusted metal can. My chest tightened. I wasn't the first person to be stuck down here. I followed the stream another half mile before I saw it. A rope dangling from the ravine wall. Old, frayed, swaying lightly in the breeze. My heart pounded. It meant someone had once tried to climb out here. Maybe they had made it. Maybe not. I tested the rope. It groaned under my weight, fibers splitting. I didn't trust it. My only choice was to keep going. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, listening to the forest come alive. Something splashed in the stream nearby. I held my breath, every muscle tight. Passed, but I never found sleep. On the third day, weak and shaking, I finally heard something new. A faint mechanical hum, far away. At first I thought I imagined it, but as I limped further, it grew louder. Then I saw it. A narrow metal bridge crossing the ravine. Rusted, old, maybe used by loggers or utility workers. I forced myself up the bank toward it. My hands bled from clawing at roots. My knee screamed, but I kept climbing. At the top, I pulled myself over the edge and collapsed onto the bridge. I lay there, staring at the sky, the first open sky I had seen in days. On the far side, A service road stretched into the trees. My legs shook, but I followed it one step at a time. Hours later, I came to a gravel lot with a locked gate. Beyond it, a paved road. I collapsed again, this time on purpose, waiting. Eventually, a truck came by. I waved with I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple. Spend a few days hiking alone through a remote stretch of mountain trails, far from the crowds, far from towns, and far from any sort of distraction. I wanted to test myself. I wanted to know what it really felt like to be alone, relying only on what I carried and what I knew. I had read trip reports, studied maps, and checked the weather over and over. Everything looked perfect. The section I picked wasn't popular. That was part of the appeal. Most people went to the more scenic routes or to the marked and groomed national park trails. The area I chose was rugged, with a mix of old logging roads, faint game trails, and long sections where there was hardly a path at all. The map showed thin lines cutting through valleys and ridges, dotted with old campsites and the occasional spring. From what I read, it was quiet country, good for solitude, not so good if something went wrong. I arrived early in the morning. The air was damp, the trees heavy with dew, and the trailhead empty. My car looked out of place, parked on the small gravel patch. I shouldered my pack, adjusted the straps, and walked past the wooden sign that warned hikers about bears, uneven terrain, and lack of rescue services. I felt confident. My pack had everything: food, water filter, stove, tent, sleeping bag, extra clothing, first aid, even an emergency beacon. I wasn't reckless. The first miles were easy. The path followed an old dirt road, wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The forest was thick but calm. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the silence. After an hour, the trail narrowed and dipped into a shaded hollow. The air grew cooler. I crossed a stream on slick stones and climbed the far bank, my boots leaving dark prints on the mud. Felt like I had stepped into another world. The canopy above shut out much of the sun, leaving everything in a green, dim light. As the morning stretched on, I kept moving deeper. I passed no one. The woods swallowed me up, and I could almost forget there was a world outside. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I sat on a flat rock, unwrapped a sandwich, and looked out over a steep drop where the trees opened enough to show the valley below. The only sounds were birds and the distant trickle of water. The trail after that was harder. It turned rocky, climbing toward a ridge. My pack dug into my shoulders as I leaned into the slope. I was sweating, and each step made my thighs burn. When I reached the top, the forest gave way to a clearing of tall grass and stunted bushes. The view was wide. Miles of ridges rolled away, layered blue and green, endless. There was no sign of people. I checked the map and compass, made sure I was still on track, then headed down the far side. The descent was steeper, with loose soil that slid under my boots. I had to plant my poles carefully to keep from falling. At the bottom, the ground flattened into marshy woods. Water glistened between the roots, and mosquitoes swarmed around me. I pushed through, swatting them away, until I found firmer ground again. By late afternoon, I was tired. I found a dry spot near a creek and set up camp. My tent went up easily. I filtered water, cooked a simple meal, and sat with my back against a tree as the sky dimmed. The forest grew quiet. As the light faded, I crawled into the tent, zipped the door shut, and lay down. The first night was fine. I heard animals moving through the brush, but nothing came close. I slept, waking only once to the call of an owl. Morning came cool and gray. I packed up and kept going. The second day was harder. The trail grew less obvious, fading into faint lines between trees. I had to stop often to check the map. I knew where I was, but it required more attention. The forest thickened. Fallen logs blocked my way, forcing me to climb over or go around. Branches clawed at my clothes. My pace slowed. By noon, I was moving through dense undergrowth where the trail all but disappeared. I pushed aside ferns taller than my head, crossed another stream, and climbed over a mess of rocks. I slipped once, banging my shin hard, but kept going. The pain throbbed, and for the first time I wondered if maybe I had bitten off more than I could handle. Still, I pressed on. The air grew hot. Sweat dripped into my eyes. I stopped often to drink. The pack felt heavier with each mile. I told myself it was fine, that this was what I came for: challenge, effort, solitude. Late in the afternoon, I noticed something. A set of boot prints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were fresh. The tread was clear, the edges sharp. Someone else had come this way not long ago. I hadn't expected that. This was supposed to be empty country. I looked around, but the forest was still and silent. No voices, no movement. I kept walking, and soon the prints veered off into the brush. I stayed on course, but the thought lingered. Someone else was out here. That night, I camped near a small clearing. I felt uneasy. I kept listening for sounds, footsteps, voices, anything, but heard only the wind in the trees. I forced myself to sleep, though it came fitful and shallow. The third day began rough. My legs ached, my back was sore, and my shin was stiff where I had hit it on the rocks. I moved slower. The forest seemed darker, the undergrowth thicker. I had to push harder to make progress. Around midday, I came to a narrow canyon. The map showed a trail skirting the edge, but it was hard to follow. The ground was unstable, crumbling in places. One wrong step and I could fall far. I picked my way carefully, gripping roots and rocks, moving inch by inch. The weight of my pack pulled at me, threatening to throw me off balance. When I finally reached the far side, my hands were raw and my legs shaking. I rested under a tree, trying to calm down. My water was running low. I knew there was a spring ahead, so I pushed forward. When I reached it, I dropped to my knees and filled my bottle, the cold water tasting better than anything I had ever had. It was then that I saw something again. Another boot print pressed into the soft soil near the spring. And this time, not just one, several. They overlapped, circling the spring. I froze. The air felt heavier. Whoever left these had been here very recently. The prints were deep, the edges sharp. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. I couldn't explain why, but a knot formed in my stomach. I filled my bottle quickly, shouldered my pack, and moved on. My pace quickened. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. I kept glancing behind me. The trail grew rougher. The forest closed in, the ground uneven and full of roots. I stumbled more often, my nerves fraying. I wanted to stop, to camp, but the thought of setting up my tent while someone else was nearby unsettled me. So I kept walking. By dusk, I was exhausted. I had to stop. I found a hollow between two ridges, hidden from the trail, and pitched my tent there. I ate quickly, barely tasting the food, and crawled inside. I lay still, listening. Sometime in the night, I woke to a sound, faint but real. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the brush. My heart pounded. I held my breath. The steps came closer, then paused. I gripped the knife I kept by my side. The steps shifted, moved past, then faded. I didn't sleep again. Morning came gray and cold. I packed quickly and moved out, nerves raw. Every sound felt amplified. I scanned the trees constantly. I no longer cared about solitude or testing myself. I just wanted to get back. The trail twisted through steep terrain. I lost it several times and had to backtrack. The forest was a maze, thick and unending. My legs shook with fatigue, my pack felt like lead, and my mind raced with thoughts of who was out there. By late afternoon, I finally reached the old logging road from the first day. Relief flooded me. I was close now, just a few more miles. I walked fast, almost running. My breath came hard, my shoulders burned, but I didn't stop. I kept glancing back, sure I would see someone following. The road stretched on, empty. At last, I saw the trailhead sign. My car sat alone in the gravel patch. My legs nearly gave out. I dropped my pack, unlocked the car, and slid inside. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The forest stood silent, the trail vanishing into the trees. Whoever had been out there, if anyone still was, I would never know. But I knew one thing. I had gone out to test myself and I had found my limit. Solitude was one thing. Knowing I wasn't truly alone was another. And that was enough to make me never hike that stretch again. I had been hiking for years, but I had never done a solo trip that pushed me past my comfort zone. Most of my hikes were day trips, and whenever I did stay overnight, it was usually with friends. But that summer, I wanted to do something different. I told myself I was ready to take on something longer and more isolated. I wanted to know if I could handle being alone for several days in the woods, carrying everything I needed on my back. I had studied maps for weeks, marked water sources, checked distances, and prepared meals carefully. I thought I was prepared. The plan was simple. 3 days, 2 nights, along a remote section of trail that looped back to the parking lot where I would leave my car. I picked a route that was less popular because I wanted quiet and solitude. That choice would come back to haunt me. The morning I started, the sky was a flat gray but not threatening. The air was cool, perfect for hiking with a loaded pack. My boots were broken in, my food was bagged by day, and my tent and sleeping bag were stuffed tight in the bottom of my pack. I started walking with confidence, enjoying the rhythm of my steps and the creak of the straps against my shoulders. The trail was narrow but well-worn, dirt packed hard with roots and rocks sticking through like bones. The first few miles went smoothly. I passed a small creek, filtered water, and kept going. Birds flitted overhead, the occasional squirrel scrambled up a tree, and everything felt alive but safe. By midday, I reached a ridge that opened to a wide view of the forest rolling out for miles. It felt endless, like a sea of green stretching to the horizon. I ate lunch there, sitting on a rock, legs dangling, enjoying the quiet. I didn't see a single person the whole day. That was exactly what I had wanted. But as the hours passed, the silence began to feel heavy. Every sound stood out. The crunch of my boots, the snap of a branch somewhere deep in the woods, the buzz of an insect that seemed to follow me for miles. That night, I found a small clearing off the trail and set up camp. I gathered wood, lit a small fire, cooked one of my pre-packed meals, and sat watching the flames dance. Darkness came fast once the sun slipped away. The fire was my only light, and outside its circle, everything was black. I crawled into my tent early, zipped the flap tight, and lay listening to the night. It was filled with noises, rustling leaves, cracking branches, far-off calls of animals I couldn't identify. I told myself it was all normal, but still I lay awake for hours before sleep finally took me. The second day started fine. I packed up, checked my map, and kept moving. The trail was steeper, winding through dense woods where the canopy blocked out most of the light. I pushed myself hard, wanting to cover as much distance as possible before the next night. By late afternoon, my legs ached, and my shoulders burned from the pack. I decided to stop near a river I had planned on reaching, but when I pulled out my map and compass, something felt wrong. The river was supposed to be wide and easy to spot, but the stream in front of me was narrow and shallow. I checked the map again, tracing the lines with my finger, trying to match them with what I was seeing. The shapes didn't add up. I realized I must have taken a wrong turn earlier, maybe at one of the overgrown junctions where the trail wasn't marked well. I told myself it was fine. I had plenty of daylight left and I could backtrack. I followed the stream for a while, hoping it would meet the real river, but the farther I went, the less certain I became. The trail under my feet grew faint, almost disappearing into underbrush. My heart started beating faster, and a creeping unease filled me. By the time I admitted I was lost, the sun was already dipping low. I knew the smart move was to stop, make camp, and figure it out in the morning. So I found a spot near the stream, cleared enough ground for my tent, and set up. I ate quickly, barely tasting the food. The forest felt different now. What had been peaceful silence the night before now pressed in on me. Every sound was sharper, more threatening. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking to noises, something splashing in the stream, twigs breaking nearby, the heavy thump of something moving through the dark. I told myself it was animals, maybe deer, maybe raccoons, Still, I lay gripping my knife, listening, waiting. When morning came, I felt wrung out and sluggish, but I forced myself to pack up. I tried to use my compass to reorient, to find the direction of the main trail, but the woods looked the same in every direction. I picked a line that I thought would take me back toward the ridge I had crossed the first day and started walking. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, the heat built, and I felt sweat soak through my shirt. My canteen grew lighter with each sip, and when I checked my food, I realized with a cold twist of fear that I had less left than I thought. I had planned for 3 days, but if I was lost, 3 days might not be enough. The forest grew denser, the ground rougher. I tripped more often, stumbled over roots, scraped my arms on branches. Around midday, I heard movement behind me. It was faint, but steady, footsteps crunching leaves, breaking twigs. My body froze. I listened hard, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal, maybe following at a distance. But part of me knew it didn't sound like 4 legs. It sounded like 2. I started walking faster. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it shook my chest. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Nothing, just shadows and trunks and endless green. But every now and then, I thought I heard it again, faint but there. Always behind me. As the day dragged on, fear gnawed at me. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that the stress of being lost was making me paranoid. But when I stopped to rest, crouched against a fallen log, I heard it again. Leaves shifting, a stick cracking, closer this time. I forced myself to keep moving until dusk. Exhaustion slowed me, but adrenaline kept me from stopping. Finally, I found a flat patch of ground and set up camp, though my hands shook the whole time. I didn't light a fire. The thought of making light felt wrong, like it would draw attention. I sat in the dark, knees pulled to my chest, straining to hear. That night was the worst of my life. I didn't sleep at all. I heard footsteps circling the camp. Slow, deliberate. At times they seemed to fade, but they always came back. I gripped my knife until my hand cramped, staring into the black, waiting for something to come through the trees. Nothing ever did. When the sun finally rose, I packed fast and left, too wired with fear to eat. I moved quickly, almost running at times, crashing through underbrush, desperate to find a real trail again. My legs shook, my body screamed for rest, but I kept pushing. Every time I slowed, I heard it again, those steps behind me, always just out of sight. By midday, I stumbled onto a clearing with an old fire ring made of stones. The ashes inside were gray and cold, but seeing it filled me with hope. Someone had camped there once. Maybe the trail wasn't far. I searched the edges of the clearing, scanning for any sign of a path. That was when I found it, a faint track leading into the woods. I followed it, heart racing. It was narrow and overgrown, but it was a trail. I clung to it like a lifeline, praying it would lead me back to the main loop. But as the hours dragged on, the trail twisted deeper into the forest without meeting anything familiar. My hope faded again. That night, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I walked until my legs gave out, stumbling in the dark, tripping over roots. Finally, I collapsed against a tree, too drained to go farther. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion won. I woke to snapping twigs. My eyes flew open. It was still dark, the forest silent except for the sound of someone moving nearby. Not fast, not running, just moving, slow and steady, circling. My skin crawled. I pressed myself against the tree, knife in hand, barely breathing. The sound lingered for what felt like hours, then faded again. At dawn, I stumbled up and kept moving, half-starved, half-mad with fear. My lips were cracked from thirst, my stomach twisted with hunger. My pack felt impossibly heavy. I dropped gear as I went, anything I thought I didn't need, just to move faster. Finally, late in the day, I saw it, the main trail, wide beaten, clear. Relief hit so hard I almost cried. I stumbled onto it, knees weak, heart pounding with joy. I followed it with everything I had left, knowing it would lead me back to the trailhead. But even then, even as I neared safety, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked until the trees thinned and the parking lot came into view, until I saw my car waiting where I had left it. When I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, only then did I let myself breathe. I sat there shaking, filthy, starving, and more grateful than I had ever been in my life. I never saw who or what was following me. I had been planning a solo hiking trip for months. It was supposed to be one of those things where I could test myself, push my limits, and see if I could handle being alone in the wilderness for a few days. I had always loved being outdoors, but I usually went with friends or joined groups. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted silence, time with my own thoughts, and the challenge of being fully responsible for myself. The trail I chose was in a remote mountain area that stretched across a series of ridges, valleys, and thick forests. It wasn't the most popular trail, but it wasn't unknown either. I had read reports online, studied maps, and prepared carefully. The trail looped around for about 40 miles, and I planned to cover it in 3 days, camping out along the way. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a filter for streams. I also carried a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a power bank for my phone, though I knew service would be almost non-existent once I got deeper in. The first morning, I parked my car near the trailhead, checked my pack, locked everything away, and set off. The sky was clear, the air was cool, and the trail was quiet except for the sound of birds. The first stretch was steep, but I was fresh and excited. I made good progress, stopping now and then to drink water and take in the view when the trees opened up. The trail led up through dense forest and then along an exposed ridge with sharp drop-offs on one side. I could see miles of rolling hills and endless green. It felt good to be up there, away from noise, away from people, just me and the trail. By late afternoon, I found a decent spot to set up camp. It was a flat clearing surrounded by trees with enough room for my tent. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, ate while the sun went down, and then zipped myself into my tent. I listened to the night sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the rustling of small animals. It was a little eerie, but I reminded myself that it was all normal. The first night passed without much trouble. I woke a few times, adjusting to the hard ground and strange noises, but I felt fine when the morning came. I ate breakfast, packed everything up, and started walking again. The second day was harder. The trail went steeper, up and down hills that seemed endless. My pack felt heavier, my legs burned, and sweat soaked through my shirt. I crossed a few streams where I refilled my bottles and filtered water. The day dragged, but I kept pushing, knowing I had a long way to go. By late afternoon, clouds started rolling in. The air grew heavy and dark, and soon enough, rain came down in steady sheets. I pulled on my rain jacket and kept walking, but the trail turned into mud, and everything got slippery. The rain made it colder too, and I could feel it soaking through the fabric after a while. I hadn't planned to camp so soon, but the storm forced me to stop earlier than I wanted. I found a spot under thick trees that gave a little cover and set up my tent as best I could with the rain pouring down. My hands were freezing by the time I got the stakes in and the rain fly over. I crawled inside, wet and tired, and tried to eat a snack. That night was miserable. The rain hammered the tent, wind shook the trees, and water pooled around the edges. I lay awake listening to every gust of wind and every creak of branches. At one point, I thought a tree might fall nearby, the cracking sound so loud I held my breath. But nothing came down, and eventually I dozed off. When morning came, everything was damp and gray. I packed up slowly, trying to keep my gear as dry as possible, though most of it was wet already. My boots squished with each step, and the trail was even worse than before. It was that third day when things really went wrong. I had been walking for hours when I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. Normally, every mile or so, there was some kind of sign, paint mark on a tree, or a small wooden post. But nothing had appeared in at least 2 hours. At first, I thought maybe I had just missed them, too focused on keeping my head down in the rain. But then the trail itself started to look faint, like it hadn't been walked much. It narrowed, overgrown in places, and soon it split into different faint paths where animals might have moved through. I stopped, pulled out my map, and tried to match the landmarks. But with the thick forest around me, no clear ridges or peaks in sight, it was hard to be sure. My GPS on the phone barely loaded, flickering between weak signals. I cursed myself for not paying closer attention earlier. I chose one of the paths that seemed most worn and kept going, hoping it would reconnect to the main trail. But an hour later, I was deeper in and still lost. The forest pressed tighter, and the ground sloped sharply down into gullies and back up again. That's when I noticed something that set me on edge. The forest was silent. No birds, no insects, no rustling. Just heavy, still air and the sound of my own footsteps. It was unnatural, the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. I kept moving, but unease grew in me. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that animals move, weather changes, silence happens. But the longer I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched. Every time I stopped, I swore I could hear faint movement behind me. Not close, but there, like something following at a distance. I didn't want to panic, so I forced myself to focus on practical steps. I needed higher ground to see where I was. I climbed a ridge, scrambling up slick rocks and grabbing roots for support. When I reached the top, I looked out, but the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I saw no trail, no clearing, no smoke, no sign of people, just trees. By then, the sun was sinking, and I knew I couldn't risk wandering in the dark. I had to camp whether I liked the spot or not. I chose a flat patch between thick trees, set my tent, and forced myself to eat something even though my stomach was tight with nerves. That night was the worst so far. The silence was unbearable. Lying in the tent, I could hear faint crunches of leaves somewhere out there. Not constant, not rhythmic, just every so often. Like something was circling far off, moving when I moved. I gripped the knife I kept near me and barely slept. The next morning, I was exhausted but determined to find my way back. I decided to follow a stream downhill, knowing water usually leads somewhere. I packed up quickly and started moving. The stream was small, but I followed its winding course, stepping over rocks and through mud. Hours passed, and though I hoped it would lead to a larger river or a crossing, it only dragged me deeper into rough valleys. At one point, I slipped on wet rock and fell hard, scraping my arm and hitting my side. Pain shot through my ribs, and I lay there for a moment, gasping. Nothing felt broken, but it shook me badly. I wrapped the cut on my arm with bandages from my kit and kept going, slower than before. By the second night of being lost, I was nearly out of food. I rationed what I had, chewing dry granola and drinking from the stream. I was hungry, weak, and scared. The noises in the forest continued. Footsteps too heavy for small animals, always distant, never close enough to see. On the fourth day, I finally stumbled into a clearing where the stream widened and met a larger river. Relief washed over me because rivers sometimes led to camps or roads. I followed it, forcing myself forward though every step felt heavier. That evening, I saw it, faint in the distance, a wooden bridge. My heart pounded as I stumbled toward it. It looked worn, maybe old, but it was something built by people. I crossed carefully, and on the other side, I found a narrow dirt road. I dropped to my knees on that road, crying with relief. I knew if I followed it, I'd find someone, or at least it would lead out. It took hours more, but eventually, I saw a parked truck at the edge of the road. It was empty, but not long after, a man came walking up with fishing gear. The sight of another person after days alone in fear almost broke me. He looked surprised, maybe even wary, but when he saw my state, muddy, bleeding, exhausted, he let me ride in his truck back toward town. I never learned what was in those woods with me. Maybe it was just deer, maybe a bear keeping its distance, maybe nothing at all but my imagination running wild after exhaustion and hunger. But I will never forget that silence, that sense of being followed, and the way every shadow seemed alive. I had set out to test myself, and I got more than I ever wanted. I was lucky to walk out alive. I had been hiking for years before this trip, and I thought I understood what it meant to be cautious, what it meant to be prepared. I wasn't reckless. I read the maps, I packed food and water, I kept an emergency kit in my pack, and I always let someone know where I was going. But there is a big difference between thinking you're prepared and actually being ready for everything that can happen when you step into a stretch of land far from help. What happened on this hike changed the way I look at the wilderness forever. I had picked a long backcountry trail in late summer. The plan was to start early in the morning, cover about 15 miles, and return before dark. It wasn't the most difficult trail in the world, but it cut through some deep forest and passed through several ridges before looping back. It was the kind of hike where you would probably see deer, maybe even a bear if you were unlucky, but it was still within a national forest that wasn't considered too dangerous. I carried a backpack with 2 large bottles of water, a filter straw in case I needed to drink from a stream, a couple of sandwiches, some jerky, a flashlight, a lighter, a folding knife, and a small first aid kit. When I parked at the trailhead, the morning was quiet. The lot had only a couple of other cars. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt from the rain the night before. I locked my car, slung my pack on my shoulders, and started down the trail. The first few miles were easy, packed dirt with roots crossing here and there, the sun breaking through the branches above me. My boots crunched in rhythm, and I felt strong, calm, and steady. After about 3 miles, the trail started climbing. It curved around the side of a ridge, and I could see through the trees down to a valley covered in thick green. The air grew warmer, and my shirt stuck to my back. I stopped a couple of times to drink water, sitting on a rock, breathing slowly, letting my pulse calm before moving again. I wasn't worried. I had done hikes like this many times, but as the day stretched on, I realized the trail was less maintained than I had expected. The path narrowed, brush pressed against my legs, and some parts looked washed out from old rainstorms. A couple of trail markers on trees were faded, almost gone. I had a paper map folded in my pocket, but I trusted the dirt path under my feet. I didn't think about turning back. By the time I reached what I thought was the halfway point, the sun had shifted and clouds were moving in. I checked my watch and saw that it was later than I planned. I sat on a fallen log, ate one of my sandwiches, and drank half a bottle of water. I told myself I would pick up the pace on the way back. I figured I could make it out before sunset. The problem started when the trail split. There were no signs. One path sloped downward through thicker brush. The other curved uphill along a rocky side. I unfolded my map and tried to match it with where I stood, but the lines didn't quite make sense. I thought I remembered reading that the loop followed the ridge, so I took the upward path. First, it seemed right. The dirt was packed, and I saw a few old boot prints. But after about 20 minutes, the trail began to fade. Branches closed in, rocks blocked parts of the way, and soon it looked less like a trail and more like an animal track. I slowed down, looked around, and felt a sharp unease in my stomach. I turned back only to realize that the way I had come from looked just as overgrown. That was the first moment I felt real fear. I tried to stay calm. I told myself I just needed to retrace my steps carefully. I followed what I thought was the trail, pushing branches aside, stepping over logs, keeping an eye on the ground. But every direction looked the same. Brown dirt, pine needles, twisted roots. My boot prints blended with others. At some point, I stopped, turned slowly in a circle, and realized I no longer knew which way I was facing. The forest was silent. I pulled out my map again, but it didn't help. I had no GPS, no phone service out there. All I could do was choose a direction and hope it led me back to the main path. I chose the slope downward, thinking it might lead to a stream or lower ground where the trail might cross again. The slope grew steeper. I slipped once, catching myself on a root, scraping my palm. My breathing grew heavy. Branches snapped against my shoulders, and sweat stung my eyes. I thought I heard water ahead, a faint trickle, and I followed it. Sure enough, I came to a narrow creek, barely 2 feet wide, winding between mossy stones. Relief rushed over me. Where there's water, there's usually a path. I crouched to drink from the creek using my filter straw. The water was cool, clean. I refilled my bottles and sat back on my heels. For a few minutes, I felt better. But then I looked up and realized the trees pressed so tightly around me that I couldn't see the sky anymore. The light had dimmed, and I knew the sun was sliding down. I followed the creek, stepping carefully along the muddy edge, but the water twisted and split, disappearing into thicker undergrowth. The ground grew softer, wetter. My boots sank, sucking in mud, and I had to pull them out with effort. The smell of damp earth filled my nose. Soon I was tangled in vines, thorns scratching at my legs, and I realized I couldn't keep following it. I turned back again, only to find the creek didn't look familiar anymore. Every bend seemed different. My chest tightened. I stopped walking and just stood there, listening. The forest was still silent, but not in a peaceful way. It was heavy, pressing silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle because you feel watched even when you're alone. I told myself I needed to climb back up toward higher ground, maybe regain the ridge where I started. I turned uphill and began pushing forward, grabbing roots, planting my boots hard into the soil. My thighs burned, my breath came fast, and the weight of my pack dragged me down, but I forced myself to keep moving. By the time I reached a small rise, the sky above the trees had turned orange. Sunset. I knew I was in trouble. I was still lost, and night was coming fast. I dug out my flashlight and tested it. The beam was strong, but I didn't know how long the batteries would last. I decided I had to stop. Hiking in the dark, off-trail, would only make me more lost, maybe even injured. I cleared a small patch of ground under a pine, brushing away needles. I sat on my pack, ate some jerky, and tried to calm myself. The forest around me darkened slowly, shadows stretching until everything was black except for the weak glow of my flashlight. The sounds changed. Crickets started up, sharp and steady. I heard rustling in the underbrush now and then, small animals moving. Once, I thought I heard something heavier, maybe a deer, but I couldn't see anything. That night was one of the longest of my life. I sat with my back to the tree, clutching my knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. Every sound made me flinch. My mind raced through possibilities: bears, mountain lions, coyotes. I knew most of them avoided humans, but being alone, lost, and surrounded by darkness made every sound feel like a threat. Sleep came only in short bursts. I would doze, then jerk awake at some noise. The ground was hard, my muscles cramped, my mouth dry even though I had water. I counted the hours, waiting for the faintest hint of morning light. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray through the trees, I stood on shaking legs and stretched stiff muscles. My body ached, but I was alive. I ate the last half of my second sandwich, drank some water, and packed up. I told myself I had to keep moving. The second day was worse. My sense of direction was gone. I chose one way, walking for hours, but the forest never thinned. The ground dipped into gullies, climbed back up ridges, twisted in endless repetition. I kept expecting to see a trail marker or even an old campfire ring, but there was nothing. Just trees, rocks, and silence. By midday, the sun was high and hot. Sweat poured down my face, soaking my shirt. My water ran low again, and I searched for another creek. I found one, smaller than the last, and drank, filling my bottles again. I thought about following it downstream, but fear of swamps and impassable thickets stopped me. I stuck to higher ground. Hours passed. My legs grew weak. I stumbled often, catching myself on trunks. My stomach growled. The jerky was almost gone. Panic pressed at the edges of my thoughts, but I forced myself to breathe, to keep walking. Late in the afternoon, I climbed another ridge. From the top, I could finally see beyond the trees. In the distance, far across another valley, I spotted a thin cut in the forest, straight lines, unnatural. Power lines, civilization. Relief almost dropped me to my knees, but they were far, and I would have to cross thick forest and another ridge to reach them. The sun was already dropping. I knew I couldn't get there before dark. Still, I marked the direction carefully, breaking branches to leave signs, and began moving that way. Night fell again before I made it far. Exhausted, I cleared another spot and settled in. I have always liked being outdoors, but I never considered myself an expert hiker. I was more of a weekend explorer, the kind of person who would take day hikes on marked trails, carry a packed lunch, and be back in the car before dark. I never had climbing gear, I never joined groups, and I had never done anything that required permits or guides. I was just someone who liked trees, fresh air, and the quiet that you can only find when you are away from everything else. It was early autumn when I decided to take a longer hike than usual. I had been working too many hours and felt worn down. I wanted to be somewhere far away from roads, where I could not hear cars or see power lines. I found a long loop trail in the mountains a few hours from home. According to the map, the full loop was about 22 miles with campsites at 2 different points. It was marked as strenuous but not dangerous, and the description made it sound like a challenge worth trying. I had done 12 miles in one day before, so I thought splitting 22 miles into 2 days with a camp overnight would be doable. I packed a small tent, a sleeping bag, a ground mat, a gas stove, a water filter, food for 2 days, and extra snacks. I filled 2 1-liter bottles and had another empty one folded up in case I needed it. My backpack was heavier than I liked, but not unbearable. I wore boots that were already broken in and a layered outfit since the mountains were cooler. I also carried a first aid kit, a headlamp, and a small knife. I thought I was well prepared. The first miles went smoothly. The air was cool, the leaves were starting to turn red and orange, and the trail was covered in soft dirt with patches of roots and rocks. I passed a few hikers in the first 2 hours, but soon the path grew quieter. The trail climbed steadily uphill, winding around ridges and valleys, and my breathing grew heavier. I stopped often to drink water. At one high point, I could see across the valleys. There were rolling hills covered in endless forest, the kind of view that makes you feel very small. As the day went on, I realized the trail was harder than I had expected. The climbs were steep, and the downhills were rough on my knees. My pack dug into my shoulders, and sweat soaked through my shirt. I kept telling myself to keep going until the first campsite, where I would set up for the night. By mid-afternoon, my legs already felt sore, but I pushed on. The first strange thing happened when I noticed how empty the trail was. I had not seen another hiker in hours. Usually on long trails, you cross paths with at least a few people, but it felt like I had the mountains all to myself. At first, I liked the solitude, but as the day dragged on, it began to feel different. The silence was thick. There were no voices, no faraway cars, not even the distant hum of airplanes, just wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. When I finally reached the campsite, it was later than I had planned. The sun was dipping low, and the sky was streaked orange. The campsite was a clearing with a fire ring and enough space for a few tents, but nobody was there. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and started setting up. I ate a quick meal of noodles boiled on the stove, then crawled into my tent. My body was exhausted, but my mind kept racing. The silence pressed against me. Even the insects sounded far away. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear a snap in the trees or the wind pressing against the fabric of my tent, and I would jolt awake. My body ached, but I was too restless to relax. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke again when the light seeped through the thin walls of the tent. The second day was supposed to be easier. I would hike the remaining miles of the loop and return to the trailhead by evening. I packed quickly and set off, but my legs felt heavy and stiff. My shoulders burned under the weight of the pack. I reminded myself that the hardest part was over. The trail that morning narrowed and began cutting across steep slopes. On my left, the ground rose sharply uphill, and on my right, it dropped into thick forest. The path was no wider than a deer track in places, and the dirt was loose. I stepped carefully, planting each foot before shifting my weight. The air grew cooler, and clouds rolled in. By midday, I had covered only a few miles. My pace was slow, and the terrain kept getting tougher. At one point, I slipped on a patch of damp leaves and skidded a few feet before catching myself on a root. My heart raced as I looked at the slope below. If I had gone over, I might have tumbled a long way down. It was around then that I noticed I had made a mistake. Somewhere along the way, I had missed a marker. The trail I was on no longer matched the map. I unfolded the paper, traced the line, and looked around. The blazes on the trees had disappeared. The ground looked less worn, as if fewer people walked this way. I backtracked a little, hoping to find where I had gone wrong, but nothing looked familiar. I told myself not to panic. I had a compass and I knew the general direction of the loop. If I kept heading east, I should eventually rejoin the main trail. I tried to keep calm and kept moving. Hours passed. The forest grew denser and the slope steeper. I scrambled over rocks, ducked under branches, and slid down gullies. My clothes caught on thorns, and mud caked my boots. My water bottles grew lighter and I rationed sips. My food was running low too. The daylight dimmed, and I realized I was in trouble. I had not found the trail again, and I was deeper into the mountains. The ground was uneven, and I kept tripping over hidden roots. My legs trembled with fatigue. I needed to stop. I found a flat patch of ground under some trees and set up my tent again, though I had no firewood and no energy to search for any. I ate a small handful of trail mix and lay down. That night was worse than the first. The air was colder, and the forest creaked and groaned. I thought I heard footsteps more than once, but every time I held my breath and listened, there was nothing. My mind kept circling back to the fact that nobody knew exactly where I was. If something happened, there would be no quick help. When morning came, I forced myself up and packed. My body screamed with pain, but I had no choice but to keep moving. I headed downhill, hoping to find water or a stream. My bottles were almost empty. After hours of stumbling, I finally heard the trickle of running water. Relief washed over me as I knelt by the stream and refilled my bottles with the filter. I drank until my stomach hurt. I followed the stream for a while, thinking it might lead me back toward the main trail or even a road. But the stream wound deeper into a ravine, and the sides grew higher until I was trapped between walls of stone and trees. The ground was slippery, and at one point, I slid and scraped my arm open. Blood streaked down to my wrist. I cleaned it with the filtered water and wrapped it with a strip of cloth from my shirt. By the fourth day, my food was almost gone. My energy dropped so low that I had to sit and rest every few minutes. My legs shook, my lips were dry, and my head pounded. I had never felt so weak. I started thinking about how long it would take before someone even realized I was missing. On the fifth day, I found signs of people. An old fire ring, blackened stones with ash scattered around. My heart lifted. I looked around for more signs, but the place seemed abandoned. Still, I knew I had to be close to somewhere. I kept moving, my eyes scanning for footprints, cut branches, or anything man-made. It was late afternoon when I finally stumbled across a dirt road. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the packed ground and tire ruts were real. I dropped to my knees from relief. The road was narrow and clearly not used often, but it was a way out. I followed it for miles, limping and half delirious. Just before dark, I reached a wooden gate with a chain across it. Beyond the gate was a wider gravel road. I dragged myself under the chain and kept walking. Not long after, headlights appeared in the distance. I waved my arms until the vehicle stopped. I was taken to safety, weak, dehydrated, and bruised but alive. Looking back, I realized how quickly things had gone wrong. I had set out for a 2-day trip on a marked loop and ended up lost for almost a week. The mistake was small, missing one trail marker, but it nearly cost me everything. The silence of the mountains, which I had once thought peaceful, had become something heavy and suffocating. Every rustle, every shadow, had pressed on me until I felt I was unraveling. Now, whenever I think about hiking, I remember those long days of stumbling through the woods with an empty stomach and shaking hands. I remember the endless trees that seemed to stretch on forever. I remember the fear of not knowing if I would ever find my way back. And I remember the moment I saw that dirt road and realized I was not going to die out there. That was the moment I understood how thin the line is between a simple adventure and a fight for survival. I had been hiking for a few years before that trip, but nothing had ever shaken me the way that one did. I thought I knew the basics: pack enough water, bring extra food, wear the right boots, study the map before heading out. I was always careful. I was not careless or reckless, and that's what made the whole experience so hard for me to accept. Looking back, I realize how small mistakes pile up quietly, and how quickly things can turn dangerous when you are alone in the middle of the woods. The hike I planned was supposed to be simple. It was in late summer, warm during the day but not brutally hot. I had picked a long trail in the mountains of western Montana, one that wound through thick forest, up to an open ridge, then looped back down. The full loop was about 15 miles. My plan was to start early in the morning, finish by evening, and drive back to the small cabin I had rented for the weekend. I packed a backpack with water bottles, a filter straw, jerky, nuts, 2 sandwiches, a rain jacket, a headlamp, and a first aid kit. I wore hiking boots I had broken in months earlier, wool socks, a thin long-sleeved shirt, and cargo pants. I carried a printed map folded into my pocket, and I had checked the route the night before. Everything seemed simple enough. The morning was calm when I parked my car at the trailhead. The gravel lot was empty except for one other truck. The air was cool, maybe 50 degrees, and I felt good as I started off. The first part of the trail ran flat through tall pines. The ground was soft with old needles, and the smell of pine resin was strong. Birds called overhead. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the way the morning light filtered through the branches. The trail eventually began to climb. The slope was gradual at first, then steeper as the trees thinned. After an hour, I reached a spot where the forest opened into a small meadow with knee-high grass. I stopped for a sip of water and looked around. The silence there was heavy, broken only by the buzz of insects. I saw the ridge in the distance, still far above me, a thin line of rock cutting against the sky. It looked both inviting and far away. I pushed on. The trail wound through switchbacks, sometimes rocky, sometimes soft dirt. Sweat gathered on my back, and I slowed to keep my breathing steady. By late morning, I had reached a dense stretch of forest again. The trees here were old and thick, moss clinging to their trunks. Sunlight barely touched the ground. I felt small walking under them. It was about then that I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. The trail split without warning. One fork went left, another right. Neither was marked. I pulled out the folded map, but it wasn't detailed enough to show small forks like this. The main route was supposed to climb toward the ridge. Looking at the slope, I guessed the left trail climbed higher, so I chose that. At first, it seemed correct. It rose uphill and felt like a main path, but after 15 minutes it narrowed, becoming overgrown with brush. Spider webs stretched across it, clinging to my face as I passed. That was not a good sign. Trails that are used often don't get this overgrown. My gut twisted, and I slowed down. Finally, after another bend, the path simply ended at a cluster of fallen trees. I stood there for a long moment, my heart sinking. I knew I should turn back, but the slope was confusing. When I tried to retrace my steps, the path wasn't as clear as I thought it would be. Every direction looked similar: trees, moss, and uneven ground. I walked one way, then doubled back. After 10 minutes of trying, I realized I couldn't even find the fork where I had made the wrong turn. The feeling that hit me then was sharp and sudden. It wasn't full panic, but something close. My chest tightened, and I felt a rush of heat. I stopped moving and forced myself to breathe slowly. I reminded myself I still had hours of daylight, plenty of food, and water. The smart thing was to calm down and move carefully. I tried walking downhill, figuring the trail must cross lower. For a while, I followed what looked like a faint track, but it dissolved into nothing. I circled back uphill. My boots scuffed through leaves and roots. Each time I thought I spotted the trail, it ended in undergrowth. The forest was playing tricks on my eyes. By early afternoon, I was exhausted from climbing and descending without progress. I sat on a log, drank water, and chewed a strip of jerky. My mind was restless. I kept replaying the moment at the fork, wishing I had chosen differently. I told myself I could still get out, but a whisper of fear was growing inside me. I had been careful all morning, and still I had ended up here. When I stood again, I noticed how quiet it had become. The forest, which earlier had been filled with bird calls and insect hum, was now still. My own footsteps sounded too loud. Every crack of a branch under my boot echoed in the silence. I felt exposed, like something unseen was watching. I shook the thought away, but the unease stayed. I climbed toward what I thought was the ridge, hoping higher ground would let me see the valley and reorient myself. The climb was brutal. The slope grew steeper, and I had to grab branches to pull myself up. My thighs burned. When I finally reached a rise, the view wasn't what I expected. Instead of an open ridge, I stood on a rocky outcrop surrounded by endless trees. I couldn't see the trailhead, the road, or any landmark, just forest stretching to the horizon in every direction. That's when the panic truly hit. My legs felt weak, and my throat tightened. The thought of being stuck overnight out there slammed into me. I had a headlamp and food, yes, but the idea of darkness filling these woods, of being alone without a trail, was crushing. I sat down on the rock and closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. I knew enough about survival to realize wandering aimlessly was dangerous. The best thing was to stay put, conserve energy, and try again later. I forced myself to eat half a sandwich, even though my stomach knotted with stress. The taste was dry, but chewing it gave me something to focus on. Hours slipped by while I sat there. The sun moved west, shadows lengthened. My hope of finding the loop and finishing the hike by evening was gone. I had to accept I might be spending the night out there. The thought made my hands shake. When the light began to fade, I looked for a place to settle. I didn't want to camp, but I needed somewhere safe enough to wait out the night. I found a small hollow between two thick tree trunks where the ground was soft with needles. I gathered fallen branches and stacked them in a loose pile for some shelter. I put on my rain jacket to keep warm as the air cooled. The forest changed as night approached. The silence grew heavier, broken by sudden cracks or rustles in the distance. Each sound made me jerk my head. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I turned on my headlamp as the last light faded, its narrow beam cutting a tunnel through the dark. The trees loomed tall and black around me. Lying there, I barely slept. Every time I drifted, some noise snapped me awake. Branches breaking, leaves moving, sometimes close, sometimes far. I couldn't tell what caused them. Animals, the wind, or my imagination. My body was stiff from the cold, and my nerves stayed raw. Hours crawled by. When dawn finally came, I felt half broken. My mouth was dry, my stomach cramped, and my body ached. But daylight brought a sliver of relief. I ate a handful of nuts, drank from my bottle, and decided to try again. My plan was to head downhill steadily, figuring I would eventually cross the main trail or reach a creek that might lead to a road. The descent was harder than I expected. Slopes were slick with loose soil and hidden roots. More than once, I slipped and slid several feet, scraping my palms. The forest grew thicker, branches clawing at my clothes. I pushed on, sweating heavily. Hours passed, and my legs trembled with fatigue. At one point, I stumbled into a small clearing where the grass was trampled. In the dirt, I saw fresh tracks, hoof prints, probably from elk. They moved in a line downhill. I decided to follow them, thinking animals often know the easiest way through terrain. For a while, the tracks gave me purpose, but they eventually split and disappeared into brush. I stood there, swaying with exhaustion, the fear rising again. By late afternoon of that second day, I began to lose confidence that I would find my way back. My water was nearly gone, and I was rationing sips. Hunger gnawed at me, my feet were blistered, and every step burned. My head felt light, and thoughts blurred. But then, finally, I heard something that snapped me awake, the faint rush of water. I pushed toward it, crashing through undergrowth until I reached a narrow creek winding through rocks. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I refilled my bottle, used the filter straw, and drank until my stomach hurt. I followed the creek, staying close to its banks. It twisted and dipped, sometimes forcing me to climb around fallen logs. As I had been planning the hike for weeks. The summer was ending, and I wanted one last trip before the weather turned colder. I picked a long loop trail through the mountains, a path that was supposed to take me 2 full days to finish if I paced myself right. I packed my gear carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, food for 2 nights, water, a filter, first aid kit, knife, flashlight, extra batteries, lighter, stove, and layers of clothing. I had done hikes before, but never alone for this long. I told myself I was ready. The trail started easy. The first few miles were wide and clear, running along a river that sounded calm. The air smelled of pine and damp dirt. The sun was strong, but under the trees it felt cool. My pack felt heavy at first, but I got used to the weight after a while. My boots pressed against the trail, and I settled into a rhythm. I kept checking the map, making sure I was on the right path, even though the trail markers were nailed clearly onto trees. I crossed little wooden bridges and stepped over fallen logs. The forest was thick, with tall trees that blocked most of the sky. Birds moved between branches, and every now and then I heard rustling deeper in the woods, probably squirrels. I felt safe at first, like it was just me and the mountain. By late afternoon, I had gone far enough to feel tired but not exhausted. The trail climbed steadily, and the trees thinned in some places, opening into rocky slopes where I could see the valley below. It was wide and green, stretching farther than I expected. The river glistened in the sun. I thought it was beautiful. I felt proud of myself for coming out here alone. I picked a spot to camp on a flat stretch near the trail, not too deep in the woods. I wanted to be close to the path so I wouldn't lose my way. I pitched the tent, boiled some water, ate noodles from a packet, and stretched out on my sleeping bag. The ground felt hard, but the air was cool and fresh. I heard insects buzzing and the faint call of owls as darkness spread. My flashlight lit the inside of the tent in a small circle of white. The first night went quietly. I woke a few times to adjust or scratch at mosquito bites, but nothing felt wrong. In the morning, I packed quickly and started walking again. The second day was harder. The trail narrowed, turning steep in sections. I had to use my hands to steady myself as I climbed over rocks. Sweat soaked through my shirt, and my legs ached, but I pushed on. I kept telling myself I would reach a high ridge where I could rest and enjoy the view. By midday, I noticed the markers were farther apart. Some were faded, barely visible on tree bark. The trail seemed less used, with more fallen branches and leaves covering the ground. I thought it was strange, but I kept going, trusting the map and compass. The forest grew denser. The air felt heavier, as if it was harder to breathe. I walked slower, listening more carefully to every sound. I could hear twigs snapping at times, far off to the side, but I told myself it was just animals. Deer maybe. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving out there, something keeping pace. I tried not to think about it. I kept my eyes on the trail and forced myself forward. When I finally reached a small clearing, I set my pack down to drink water. The silence pressed against me. I realized I hadn't heard birds for a while. The woods seemed too quiet. I swallowed fast and put the bottle away. I walked again, but the trail twisted strangely. My map didn't match what I saw. The line showed a steady curve, but the ground seemed to rise and fall without direction. I began to doubt myself. I turned back, thinking maybe I had missed a marker, but after a few minutes, nothing looked familiar. My stomach sank. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. I forced myself to calm down and checked my compass. I tried to set a direction that would take me back toward the main path, but the forest felt endless. The trees all looked the same. I walked carefully, scanning trunks for the faded markers, but I saw nothing. Time dragged. My legs grew weak, and sweat stung my eyes. The sun was sinking, and the shadows stretched longer. I realized I would have to camp again, even though I wasn't on the trail anymore. I hated that thought, but it was safer than walking in the dark. I picked a spot between 2 thick trees, trying to convince myself it was okay. I built the tent quickly, lit my stove, and ate a small meal, but I had no appetite. I kept glancing around as I chewed. Every crack in the woods made me freeze. That night, I couldn't sleep. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't settle. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening hard. Several times I swore I heard soft footsteps outside. Not heavy like a bear, not light like a rabbit, but steady, measured, as if someone was moving slowly around me. I held my breath each time, waiting for it to stop. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I gripped my knife inside the sleeping bag. I told myself it was probably branches shifting or an animal sniffing around, but deep down I knew it felt different. At one point, something brushed the side of my tent, just a faint drag, like a hand or a stick scraping along the fabric. I froze completely, barely able to breathe. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight, but fear kept me pinned in place. Hours passed like that. I must have drifted into short bursts of uneasy sleep, because I woke to faint light through the tent wall. Morning. Relief hit me, but only a little. I packed quickly, barely ate, and started walking. The woods seemed tighter now, darker, even in daylight. I tried to find higher ground, thinking if I climbed up I could see the valley or river and reorient myself. I scrambled up a ridge of rocks, my hands raw from gripping. At the top, I looked out. All I saw was more trees, stretching endless in every direction. No trail, no clearings, nothing. Panic built in my chest. I forced it down and climbed back down. I kept walking, using the compass to stay in one direction, hoping I would eventually hit a road or the river. But the day stretched on, and nothing changed. I rationed my water and food carefully, but the fear ate at me more than hunger. Every sound behind me made me turn fast. I felt watched. I couldn't see anyone, but the sense never left. By late afternoon, clouds gathered, and rain started falling. First light, then heavy. My clothes clung to me, cold and wet. The ground turned slippery. I stumbled and fell more than once, scraping my knees and hands. I cursed under my breath, but no sound in the world felt right. I found another clearing and set up my tent in the rain, fumbling with shaking hands. I crawled inside, soaked, teeth chattering. The storm hammered the fabric. I huddled in the sleeping bag, shivering. That night, the sounds returned. Footsteps, closer this time. Pauses, as if someone was standing just outside, waiting. My stomach knotted. I gripped the knife again, my palms slick with sweat despite the cold. Suddenly, I heard a clear snap, like a branch breaking under weight. Not far, then silence. I lay frozen for hours, eyes wide in the dark. My mind raced with every possibility. An animal stalking me, a person hiding in the woods, someone who didn't want me here. When morning came, I felt broken inside. My body was sore, my face hollow from lack of rest. I forced myself to keep moving, though every step felt heavy. By midday, I saw something ahead, a shape between trees. I froze, squinting. It was an old structure, a cabin, half-rotted, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Relief and dread hit me at the same time. Shelter meant safety, but who had built it and who might still use it? I approached slowly, every nerve on edge. The door hung crooked, creaking in the wind. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mold. There were broken chairs, scraps of fabric, a rusted stove. Dust covered everything, but the floor showed tracks. Faint, but there. Someone had been here more recently than I wanted to believe. I didn't stay long. The place felt wrong. I backed away and kept walking, trying not to think about who else might be wandering these woods. The third night was the worst. I didn't bother with the tent. I found a spot under thick branches and curled in the sleeping bag, clutching the knife. The noises came again, closer than ever. Soft steps, then stillness. My chest tightened with every second. At one point, I swear I heard breathing, faint and slow, just beyond the trees. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn came, I forced myself up and kept moving, half delirious from exhaustion. At last, near midday, I heard something different. Water. Steady rush. My legs stumbled toward the sound. I broke through thick brush and saw the river. Relief washed through me so hard I nearly collapsed. I followed it downstream, knowing rivers often lead to roads or towns. Hours later, I saw a wooden bridge in the distance. Beyond it, a dirt road. I had been planning the hike for months. I wanted to do something that tested me, something that wasn't just a casual weekend stroll down a well-traveled trail. I picked a route through a section of forest that was known for being quiet, rugged, and not heavily trafficked. The trail ran along the edge of a mountain range, passed through a dense stretch of woods, and eventually climbed up into higher ground with steep ridges and narrow paths. I had read online that not many people went there compared to the popular routes. That was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted space. I wanted to be alone and push myself. When the morning came, I started early. I parked my car in a small gravel pull-off by the side of a service road. The air was cool and damp. My backpack was heavy, packed with water, food, a tarp, a sleeping bag, and some emergency gear. I told myself I would spend one night out there before returning. It didn't sound like much, but I knew the trail was tough and I had to be prepared. The first stretch went well. The path was overgrown in places but still visible. Tall grass brushed against my legs, and spiderwebs stretched across the openings between branches, breaking against my face every so often. I kept a steady pace, pushing deeper into the trees. I felt good, strong, and alive in the quiet. Hours passed as I walked. The trail narrowed and began climbing gradually. Thick roots twisted across the dirt, forcing me to lift my boots higher. The air got heavier as the forest closed in. The sound of birds was faint and scattered. It felt like the deeper I went, the fewer living things were around. I noticed how isolated it seemed compared to more popular hiking areas where you'd run into people every half hour. Here there was nothing, just the crunch of my steps and the faint swish of branches. By midday, I had made it into the foothills. The slope was steeper and the path was less clear. I had to stop several times to check my map and GPS. The forest here seemed to twist around itself, and it was easy to get turned around if I didn't pay attention. The ground was damp, mossy in places, and scattered with fallen logs that forced me to climb over. As I moved forward, I started noticing signs that this part of the trail didn't see many visitors. Branches had grown over sections of the path. Fallen trees had not been cleared. Some stretches looked like no one had walked them in years. My legs were burning, and sweat ran down my back under the straps of my pack. Late in the afternoon, I reached a narrow ridge with a steep drop on one side. I stopped to catch my breath and look out over the valley below. The view was huge, endless green rolling out for miles. It should have felt calming, but instead, it gave me a strange feeling, like I was too far away from everything. The silence out there was heavy. I stood for a while, drinking water, trying to shake the unease before pushing on. The trail after the ridge sloped down into a darker stretch of woods. Tall pines closed in overhead, cutting out most of the light. The ground was covered in dead needles, soft and muffled under my boots. The air here smelled sharper, resin mixed with damp earth. I moved slower, my shoulders tense without even realizing it. By evening, I was tired and ready to stop. I found a flat clearing just off the trail, big enough to set up my tarp and roll out my bag. I set down my pack and stretched, feeling the strain in my back. I ate a quick meal from the food I brought and sat still, letting the woods settle around me. The sun dipped lower, and the clearing grew darker. That was when the forest began to change in a way that I didn't expect. First, it was just the quiet. The birds that had been chirping faintly earlier were gone. The usual small noises you hear in the woods, bugs, distant rustling, seemed to fade. It wasn't total silence, but close. I told myself it was normal, just evening settling in. Still, it felt strange. I lay in my sleeping bag after dark, staring up at the tarp above me. The air had cooled, but I couldn't relax. Every crack of a branch made me open my eyes wider. Every faint rustle in the distance set my nerves on edge. It felt like the trees were pressing closer, the dark stretching thicker around me. I tried to breathe steady, but my body was wound tight. Hours passed in restless silence. I must have dozed off because I woke suddenly to the sound of movement. It was faint but real. Not the snap of a small animal, not the scurry of something light. This was heavier, deliberate. I froze, listening. Came again. Slow steps in the needles not too far off. My chest tightened. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe an elk. The rational thought helped a little, but deep down something felt wrong. I stayed completely still. The footsteps didn't come closer, but they didn't go away either. They seemed to move slowly around, stopping, then starting again. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard outside my tarp. I clenched my hands tight, trying to keep calm. After what felt like forever, the sound drifted away. I stayed awake until my eyes burned, not daring to move, listening to every sound until exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I woke the next morning, the clearing was quiet again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, weak but enough to see. I got up stiffly, looking around. Nothing was disturbed, nothing seemed different, but the unease clung to me. I packed quickly, ready to move on. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the thought of those footsteps. My mind tried to make sense of it. A deer, a bear maybe, though the pace hadn't seemed right. It had felt slower, more cautious, like something careful about being noticed. I pushed myself harder, wanting distance between me and that clearing. The trail grew rougher. I crossed sections of loose rock, climbed over downed trees, and squeezed through overgrown brush. Hours passed, my legs heavy, my pack rubbing sore spots on my shoulders. Sweat dripped into my eyes. I was too focused on pushing forward to notice at first, but after a while, I realized something unsettling. I felt like I was being followed. Every so often, when the trail bent or when I stopped to drink water, I thought I heard faint steps behind me. When I turned, there was nothing, just empty trees and shadows. I told myself it was in my head, nerves from the night before, but the feeling didn't leave. By late afternoon, I was drained. I needed to rest, but I didn't want to stop on the trail. I found a rocky ledge above a slope and sat down, setting my pack beside me. The forest spread out below, quiet and still. I tried to eat, but my stomach was tight. The sense of being watched was almost unbearable. That was when I noticed something that made my chest go cold. On the slope below, just far enough that I couldn't make out details, I saw movement. A figure, not an animal too tall, too upright. It stood between the trees for a few seconds, barely visible, then shifted out of sight. I froze, staring at the spot until my eyes hurt. Nothing moved again. The woods stayed still. I didn't move for a long time. My whole body felt locked up. Finally, I forced myself to grab my pack and keep walking. My legs were weak, but adrenaline pushed me. I wanted out of those woods more than anything. The rest of the day was a blur of fear. Every shadow looked like movement. Every sound made my heart slam in my chest. I pushed harder than I thought I could, barely stopping, until the light began to fade again. I had no choice but to camp another night. I found a spot near a cluster of rocks and set up quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't eat much. I didn't want to. My stomach was twisted too tight. As darkness fell, the woods went silent again. I lay awake, heart hammering, listening for any sound. Came again. Slow, steady movement somewhere in the trees. I felt the hair on my arms rise. It circled closer this time. I stayed frozen, gripping my knife, though I knew it wouldn't help much. Hours passed with me lying there, hardly breathing, every nerve on fire. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under again. When I woke at dawn, my throat was dry, my body stiff. My pack was where I left it. Nothing was touched, but I knew I couldn't stay another night. I had to get out. That day, I didn't stop. I barely drank, barely ate. I just kept moving. My legs shook with the effort. My shoulders screamed from the weight of the pack, but I didn't slow down. I wanted to reach the trailhead, the road, anything. By late afternoon, I saw signs I was getting closer to the edge of the woods. The trees thinned, and the ground sloped downward. My chest loosened just a little, but the feeling of being followed never left. I forced myself not to look back anymore. I just walked, fast and steady. When I finally saw the gravel road through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I stumbled out of the forest, legs trembling, and walked quickly to my car. My hands shook as I unlocked it and threw my pack inside. I got in, started the engine, and pulled away without looking back. I have always liked hiking alone. Most people I know think it's reckless, maybe even stupid, but there's something about being out there in the silence of the woods, away from the noise of everything, that clears my mind better than anything else. For years I told myself that if I kept my routes marked, brought the right gear, and stayed alert, nothing bad would happen. For a long time I was right. Then came the hike that changed everything I thought I knew about safety. It was in late September, the kind of time when the days are still warm but the nights carry a heavy bite of cold. I had driven out to a range of hills a few hours from my home. They weren't famous, not part of any well-known park, but I had read on some forum that there were trails out there hardly anyone touched anymore. That was the appeal for me. The idea of walking a path that had almost been forgotten made it feel like an adventure, something raw. I set off early in the morning. The sky was pale, washed with the light of a sun still climbing, and the air had that damp smell of earth and leaves that only happens when the dew hasn't burned off yet. My backpack felt heavy at first: water bottles, trail food, first aid kit, a small emergency blanket, flashlight, a map I had printed, compass, and a folding knife. I told myself it was more than enough. I wore layers, a light jacket that I could tie around my waist if it got hot, and boots I had worn for months to break them in. The first hours were easy. The trailhead was faint but still visible, the dirt path worn down enough to follow without second-guessing. The trees pressed in close, a mix of pine and oak, and the ground was littered with needles and dead leaves that crunched under my boots. Now and then I stopped to sip water and check the map. The markings were old, but they matched what I saw around me well enough. After maybe 3 hours of steady walking, the trail started to narrow. Grass grew up between patches of dirt, and fallen branches lay across the way. It was clear not many people came this far. That was exactly what I wanted. I kept going, feeling good, moving deeper into the hills where the air seemed fresher, sharper. At midday, I stopped on a small rise to eat. I pulled out a sandwich, chewed slowly, and looked out over the valley I had climbed out of. The view was endless trees, rolling out like waves of green under the sun. I felt small in the best way. I drank, packed up, and pushed on. That was when the trail began to vanish. At first, it was subtle. The dirt faded into grass, and the gaps between trees grew uneven. I found myself stepping around brambles, ducking under branches, and pushing through brush. I told myself it was still there, just faint, covered by growth. But after another hour, I realized I wasn't on any trail anymore. I stopped, looked back, and felt a sudden weight in my stomach. The way behind me didn't look like a trail either, just trees. I pulled out the map. It didn't help. The lines were too vague, too general. I had taken turns without thinking, gone down slopes, and climbed over ridges without marking them. The compass needle pointed north, steady and indifferent. I tried to match the landmarks, but out here every tree looked like the last. Every hill rolled into another. Still, I didn't panic. I told myself I could backtrack. I turned around and started walking the way I thought I had come. I moved carefully, scanning the ground for my boot prints, for broken twigs, for anything. For a while, I found some signs that reassured me. A bent stem, a scuffed patch of dirt, but the deeper I went, the harder it was to tell. Soon, it all looked the same. By late afternoon, the light had changed. It had that golden edge that means the day is slipping away faster than you want it to. I hadn't found the trail. My water bottles were half empty. My legs felt heavy. I told myself I would stop soon, set up a small camp, and try again in the morning. I found a flat patch between some rocks and trees and dropped my pack. I laid out the emergency blanket, sat, and ate some jerky. The silence pressed in hard. No voices, no distant hum of cars, not even the drone of planes overhead. Just wind moving through leaves and, once in a while, the cry of some bird I didn't know. When the dark came, it came fast. The trees swallowed the light, and soon I couldn't see more than a few feet without the flashlight. I kept the beam low, trying not to waste batteries. I pulled my jacket tighter and lay down on the blanket. The ground was cold and hard, and every sound made me sit up and listen. A branch snapping far off, leaves rustling, something small moving just outside the circle of light. I told myself it was animals, always animals. Sleep was shallow, broken by the cold biting through the blanket and the constant shift of noises in the dark. At some point, I drifted into dreams that felt too close to waking. I dreamed of walking through endless trees, the path vanishing under my feet no matter how fast I moved. I dreamed of water I couldn't reach, of shadows moving just behind me. When morning came, it wasn't relief I felt, but a kind of dull heaviness. The sky was gray, clouds sliding in, and the air smelled like rain. My stomach turned with hunger as I ate a few crackers. I packed up and started walking again, picking a direction and convincing myself it was right. The ground grew rougher. I climbed over slick rocks, pushed through thorns that tore at my jacket, and slid down slopes covered in loose dirt. My legs ached. Sweat ran down my back even though the air was cool. By noon, the clouds had thickened, and the first drops of rain tapped against the leaves. Started slow, then built into a steady fall that soaked everything. My jacket wasn't enough. Water slid down my neck, dripped into my boots, and turned the ground to mud. The map turned soft and tore at the folds. The compass needle spun steady, but it meant nothing when the land around me gave no sign of where I was. The rain lasted for hours. By the time it eased, everything was slick and heavy. I stumbled on wet roots, fell once and scraped my palm raw against stone. My food was running low. My water bottles were nearly empty. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat under a low rock ledge, shivering, watching the forest around me. I thought I saw movement sometimes, not shapes but flickers, something darting between trees, something pale in the distance. I knew it was probably my eyes playing tricks in the low light, but it kept my muscles tight and my breath short. On the third day, hunger hit hard. My stomach cramped, and my head felt light. I rationed the last of the jerky and sucked at the empty water bottle, wishing for more. I thought about finding a stream, listening for water, but the forest was quiet except for wind. By late afternoon, I began to realize how serious it had become. The forest stretched in every direction, endless, and I was just one small, weakening figure in it. My hands shook when I tried to tie my boots tighter. My legs trembled after short climbs. I had the thought, sharp, sudden, that no one knew exactly where I was. No one would think to look here. That night, the noises came closer. I heard movement in the undergrowth, heavy steps, then silence. My heart thudded in my throat. I gripped the folding knife, small and useless against anything larger than a rabbit. I sat awake until dawn, eyes wide, body stiff, waiting. On the fourth day, I found water, a thin trickle running down rocks, pooling in a muddy dip. I dropped to my knees, cupped my hands, and drank. It was cold, metallic, full of grit, but I didn't care. I filled the bottles, knowing I should boil it but not having the means. My stomach twisted afterward, cramps hitting sharp, but it was better than nothing. I kept walking, weaker now. My feet were blistered, heels raw, toes swollen. My jacket was torn. The map was a useless wad of paper. I moved through the forest like a shadow. No clear direction, just forward. That evening, as the sun dipped, I stumbled into something that froze me. Clearing. In the middle of it, the remains of an old fire pit, blackened stones arranged in a ring. Beside it, a collapsed wooden frame that might once have been a lean-to. My chest swelled with hope. Someone had been here once, maybe recently. I searched the ground, the ashes, the wood. Everything was damp, rotting, old. No sign of people. The hope drained away, leaving me hollow. I sat there until the stars came out, staring at the fire pit, wishing for smoke. The fifth day blurred. Hunger was constant, sharp at first, then dull, then just a fog that made my thoughts slow. My steps grew clumsy. I fell more often, scraping my knees, bruising my arms. I I thought about my house, my bed, food in the fridge. I thought about how far away it all felt, like another life. Late that day, climbing a ridge, I slipped. My foot caught, and I went down hard, rolling, crashing through brush until I hit the ground flat. Pain shot through my ankle, hot and blinding. I screamed, but the sound died into the trees. I tried to stand, but my leg buckled.